Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Florida. And today our question comes to us from Tika Carr. And Tika in fact has two questions, both of which are follow-ups to earlier vlogs on the subject of timelines and crossing from one timeline into another. And Tika's two questions are these. The first is, how could you tell if you had unconsciously moved from one timeline to another? And her second question is, why can we not consciously perceive all of the timelines? Why can we only consciously perceive the one that we are in? And to answer the first question, in most cases, you would not be able to tell that you had unconsciously moved from one timeline to another. It would be a completely unconscious process. However, on occasion, people would notice that certain things were different from what they remembered. Usually, people just dismiss this. And I will say that it is important to remember that sometimes we really have simply remembered it wrong. But other times, particularly for those of us who practice metaphysics, we must admit that it actually was different. And when people have crossed from one timeline to another, sometimes they'll find that they remember well-known events differently from other people, that certain things are not as they remember them. Perhaps familiar objects are a different color than they remember. Perhaps people might look a little different than they remember. Sometimes people that are very familiar to them either are not there or are different from what they remember. Usually in very small ways, sometimes in significant ways. It depends just how far you've crossed through differing timelines. Generally speaking, people don't cross terribly far at a time, and there will only be subtle differences. When we do this consciously, of course, it's an entirely different question. And we would look for the changes to be there because we'd expect them. But when you've done it unconsciously, you don't actually know that you've done anything. And so it's very easy to dismiss those changes when you see them. When you've done it consciously, you obviously would not dismiss them because you know you've done something. So generally speaking, if you've crossed from one timeline to another unconsciously, you're never going to know. But if you do look for things that are not as you have remembered them, well, you might see that you have in fact made a change. Now, as for the second question, why do we consciously perceive only the timeline we are in and not all of the others? This is also the same reason that we perceive the particular dimension we are in and those that are, for want of a better way to put it, below that dimension, but cannot easily perceive those that are above. Our understanding comes to us with our conscious mind, and we cannot understand what is beyond its capabilities. We can expand that consciousness and that ability to understand and process events. And in fact, we do this constantly. But until we've done so, we cannot process an event that is beyond its comprehension. And for most of us, we are still very much involved in ordering our experiences in a certain sequential way, and anything that challenges that order, we're not going to be able to easily perceive. Therefore, we perceive the timeline that we are in, and even if we change from one to another, we generally will still perceive it as if it were the same, because our mind is simply not prepared for anything else until we have expanded our consciousness enough to be aware of it and have understanding of it. Now, people who work with this sort of thing can to some extent perceive those other timelines as well. But this is something that has to be learned and worked with, and it has to open in a gradual way, or else it becomes a shock that can cause you to lose your place in reality, which is also a recent vlog we've talked about. But if you expand your consciousness in a systematic and sequential way, you can greatly expand what you're capable of perceiving and understanding. But until you've done that, or unless you've done that, you can only really understand what you can understand, and moving from one timeline to another for most people is beyond their understanding. Therefore, they do not perceive it, and it is a bit of a shock to them when they're first exposed to it. When I was first exposed to these teachings, many, many years ago, back in the age of the dinosaurs, my first reaction was it was completely beyond my comprehension. I could not wrap my mind around it, I could not understand it, and luckily for me, my teacher, Lady Crystal, said, "Okay, we'll come back to this later." And about 6 months later, we came back to the very same material, and it was completely understandable, because in the meantime, my consciousness had expanded. And if you find yourself having this problem with more advanced metaphysical material, this is what I would recommend to you. Step away from it for a while and then come back later. Anyway, these would be my thoughts on the matter. I hope you find them helpful, and until next time, may you blessed be. The Tarot of Hecate. My 100-card tarot deck, 30 years in the making, finally available to you from witchschoolstore.com. Check out a copy today.